And I think we can't talk about women's health and wellness as it relates to gynecologic disease without talking about our metabolism. And I'm not talking about the calories in, calories out model. I'm not talking about exercise necessarily and burning fat and calories. And I'm talking about how metabolism and our favorite hormone, insulin, and how that really relates to gynecologic disease. It's kind of like nature's way of keeping us focused on one kid, okay? If our estrogen levels were back up to the normal phase, then we would start ovulating again, and then we would have another baby, okay? And so to have low estrogen levels prevents ovulation. Your question is, some menopausal, perimenopausal women have heavy bleeding. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Yes.
Or a menstrual cycle that doesn't seem to stop.
Yes.
For weeks.
So remember, there's a couple of reasons. So the first is it a heavy bleed because they're having an anovulatory cycle that has to do with ovulation? And then there's another thing about, is it the structure of the uterus and the lining of the uterus that has inflammation at the blood vessels that are making it difficult for the microvasculature to constrict, okay?
And so in terms of migraine, it is genetic on its own. And the genetic presentation of migraine, the cause of migraine is a different brain, which is intolerant to carbohydrates. So if we resolve the metabolic disease, then we resolve the migraine as well. And you know, many times people tell me, but I have different migraines. That you can't have different migraine. It's like you can't say that you have a different type 2 diabetes. It's like the cause is always the same for all diseases. The presentation may be different. You may have slightly different symptoms, because basically migraine is a genetic difference in the brain of a migraine sufferer versus a person who isn't a migraine sufferer. So if you are not a migraine, if you don't have a migraine brain, no matter how bad your menopause or perimenopause is, you can't get a migraine. It just doesn't happen. You can get a headache, not a migraine. Potassium cannot go through a sodium door because the potassium is much bigger. And this is very important because when you eat food and you drink water and then you say urinate, we excrete a lot of sodium by our urines, but not potassium. There would be a gut flora connection because gut flora is part of you. It's a very large part of your body. And so it is going to affect what is going to be the nutrient outcome for you. If I feel that I have sort of outlived my welcome for eating all the sugar or eating all the watermelon or whatever else, then I have the backup of, okay, I need to restore my salt. And then I will take a salt capsule right away, which I always do, by the way, and I double up all the time. So I never go without salt. Somebody asked me just yesterday, do you always carry? I said, yes, I don't go without salt, even to the bathroom. We follow every carbohydrate meal with a salt capsule or salt without water, because the point is that the glucose takes also water out of the body. So when you take salt, the salt is going to bring the water back into the cell. And so it's going to change the entire environment. Just taking salt, that's fantastic. And if you're very thirsty, don't drink water, just take salt, because that means that, unless of course you haven't had water and you're totally dehydrated, but if you eat some fruit or some vegetable that has carbohydrates in it, if you end up thirsty, don't drink water, just take salt.
Hello everyone, this is Nairi from Low Carbon Fasting. Well, this episode is the first of a new series on this channel where people from different scientific disciplines come together to create a fascinating conversation. Now, today I have two doctors, a PhD and an MD, and they're coming together to mainly discuss women's health from pregnancy to menopause. Dr. Andrea Salcedo and Dr. Angela Stanton, both of whom I've hosted on this channel before. The links will be below. Check them out. To both of you, welcome to Low Carbon Fasting.
Thank you for the invitation. Yeah, great.
This is so exciting. And I'm not only excited to have you both on this channel, but also about the topic itself. Women's health, we don't talk about women's health much, but Dr. Salcedo has a YouTube channel actually, and she's producing wonderful, she's putting out wonderful content that covers women's health. And of course, we know about Dr. Stanton's contribution to women's health, especially when it comes to migraines. So very brief introduction to my viewers who haven't met these two wonderful doctors before. Okay. Dr. Andrea Salcedo is a medical doctor. She specialized in osteopathic medicine and metabolic health. She's assistant professor in the Department of Gynecology and Obstetrics at Loma Linda University. She has a YouTube channel, and she's called the Conscious Gynecologist on social media and on YouTube. Now, Dr. Stanton, Angela Stanton, holds a PhD in neuroeconomics, and my understanding of it is that it combines neuroscience and economics. So she also holds several certifications, including a master's degree, ranging from areas from mathematics to biomedical sciences. She's also the author of Fighting the Migraine Epidemic. I've hosted her. I've hosted both of these doctors on my channel before. I will put the video links below so you can check them out. Today, we're talking about women's health. Andrea, on your YouTube channel, you have this phrase that really caught my eye, and I think it's a new one you've just recently added. And you say integrated womanhood and metabolic health. That kind of suggests to me that we cannot talk about women's health without talking about metabolic health.
That's right. That's right.
A little bit more.
It's something, yeah, it's something. Thank you so much for having me, by the way. And it's been a lot of fun chatting with you and meeting you over the last couple of years. And of course, my favorite, Dr. Stanton, it's just, I feel like there's no contest. I don't know why I'm even here, because she's just so knowledgeable and skilled. But the honor is mine to be here. Integrated womanhood and metabolic health, to me, just encompasses all of the things that we need to keep in mind to have fulfilling lifestyle as women. And I think we can't talk about women's health and wellness as it relates to gynecologic disease without talking about our metabolism. And I'm not talking about the calories in, calories out model. I'm not talking about exercise necessarily and burning fat and calories. And I'm talking about how metabolism and our favorite hormone, insulin, and how that really relates to gynecologic disease. And so how really as women, and I hate saying this, but for better or for worse, among all of us professional women, we were made to have babies. And if we, our biology is going to protect us so that we don't have babies at a time that's not right for us. And so insulin is intimately related to that. And if our insulin levels are high for whatever reason at all, our inflammatory levels are high, our body is going to keep us from having a baby at a time that's not right. And so then it's going to protect us by stopping our menstrual cycle. And so really that's kind of my North Star. Inflammation also with damaging the blood vessels that create pregnancy, that create ovulation, those things. And then of course, as we gain and advance and mature in our womanhood, there's different things that come up from that. But you cannot not talk about womanhood without talking about metabolic health.
You mentioned insulin. Of course, that's one of my favorite hormones, a hormone of interest to me because of my type 1 diabetes. But I remember with Dr. Stanton, when we were talking about migraines, I remember the role of insulin, or insulin resistance rather, when it comes to women's health. So migraine is also partly a metabolic health issue, right?
It is very much so, because it is, okay, so we have to separate two things here. Actually more than two things. So one is of course you have to have a genetic predisposition to getting type 2 diabetes or type 1 diabetes or any kind of metabolic disease. And then how the metabolic disease presents itself can change depending upon your genetic makeup. So some people may end up with Alzheimer's disease. Some people may be getting multiple sclerosis or something similar, whereas another person may get type 2 diabetes. So this is something that's very strongly, we all have metabolic disease sensitivity, but what way it will present is genetic. And so in terms of migraine, it is genetic on its own. And the genetic presentation of migraine, the cause of migraine is a different brain, which is intolerant to carbohydrates. So this is how it connects to metabolic health, is that if we eat too much carbohydrates, then our brain isn't going to be able to work too well, because and I mean we, because I'm a migraine sufferer, so I don't mean you two who aren't, but those of us who are, our brains, we are predisposed to have that presentation of a metabolic disease that we end up with migraine. So if we resolve the metabolic disease, then we resolve the migraine as well. And you know, many times people tell me, but I have different migraines. That you can't have different migraine. It's like you can't say that you have a different type 2 diabetes. It's like the cause is always the same for all diseases. The presentation may be different. You may have slightly different symptoms, but the cause of every single one disease is going to be always the same, but your response to it may differ. And so when we're talking about the metabolic disease, yeah, for me, it's a presentation with migraine, may also present as type 2 diabetes in other forms, but maybe it won't present to me as PCOS, you know, with my sexual organs, or gestational diabetes. I mean, it's just different presentations.
Of course, there are unfortunate women who have all these, or a number of these presentations.
Right.
So that must be a tough one. When I complain about one thing or another, I always think of women who are presenting with not just migraines, insulin resistance, on top of type 1 diabetes, because my community, the people that I associate with are mostly type 1 diabetics. So suddenly they have now migraines, and they're perimenopausal as well. So they're very similar. So they're my age, and they're perimenopausal symptoms, which on their own can be quite unbearable. And I know that they were for me. Andrea, can we talk about perimenopause? Now, I am not very forgiving of myself, because whether it was ignorance or arrogance, thinking that it will never come my way, you know, because I'm in good health, all the symptoms that were insufferable for me personally over the last, I would say, I'm 51 now, so over the last 3 years, they all started at 40 when I was 48. I put it down to other things. Anything except perimenopause. It just was not even in my mind. I did not relate. I did not connect my symptoms to perimenopause. And this is why I'm so passionate now to really talk more openly about women's health, because I don't think there is enough. If I search anything about specifically type 1 diabetes, for example, and perimenopause, there's nothing out there, nothing. Okay, so when it comes to perimenopause, we're going to cover pregnancy in a minute, but let's start with the perimenopause. What are some of the most common symptoms that you see in women? Because for me, in my mind, it was interrupted menstrual cycles. And that, in fact, that would have given me a good hint that, okay, so I must be perimenopausal. But I was having, in fact, I still am having regular cycles, like a clock. So that was one reason for me personally. I didn't think of perimenopause, but every other symptom is classic perimenopausal symptoms. So what's happening in my case then, if you don't have interruption in the cycle, in the menstrual cycle?
Yes, so that's a really great question. And what we're talking about is the climacteric state, which is basically the fancy term for perimenopause, the progress, the process of getting there. It's actually a 10-year process, right? And so, that's a long time. I mean, it started for you probably way before then. And I think as women, we're very good at compartmentalizing and saying, oh, these symptoms are from this thing that happened to me, or I'm having trouble sleeping because of this X, Y, and Z. But constellation, all of those symptoms that you were describing are very legitimate perimenopause symptoms, fatigue and irritability and short-tempered and difficulty sleeping, difficulty staying asleep, waking up at 3 a.m. oftentimes, vaginal dryness, maybe a lack of interest in libido, truly also, some weight gain, difficulty with losing weight. All of those things are related to my other favorite hormone, which is estrogen. And estrogen really comes from the ovary as, secreted from the ovary. But over time, our ovarian reserve will decline. And so because we have less circulating estrogen hormone, then we'll have more and more of those withdrawal effects, those withdrawal symptoms of everything that you're talking about. I always laugh that estrogen is kind of like what makes us feel like a woman. It makes us feel beautiful and gives us energy, and it makes us interested in sex and focused, all of those things that are part of our womanhood. However, once we go through the change of life, but another phase of life that I liken it to, there's actually 2 other phases of life, but one is when women are on birth control pills. And birth control pills are very helpful for preventing birth, right? If we use them as how we're supposed to. But a lot of times women describe a lot of the same symptoms that women talk about: lack of libido, dissatisfaction with fun things, normal things that they usually were excited about. That has to do with the lack of estrogenic changes that relate to the metabolic cycle, to the menstrual cycle. And so, to have those ebbs and flows within our menstrual cycle is really important because it makes us feel happy, and there's different moods that come with it, and they're very functional. But when we go through the menopause transition, there's just less and less of that estrogen hormone. And then one of the things that I really am excited about is when we learn about how that relates to metabolism, is that once we have declining estrogen over time, it actually restructures our adipose tissue. And if it restructures our adipose tissue from our periphery, like our hips and thighs, and it starts to structure and bring more of that to our abdomen. And so that's why a lot of women have a lot more harder time losing weight around our midsection during that time because of the change in estrogen receptors that happen. And then that abdominal visceral adiposity is very hyperinsulinemic. It's very inflammatory. And so because of that, we have struggles with losing weight. We have struggles with diabetes and hyperglycemia. We have more migraines that start to happen during these times. And so, it's very frustrating. And so then once we hit that transition, our metabolic health is that of the same of a man at that time, okay, because of the protective factor that we had with estrogen protection in our cardiovascular health and our muscles and stuff has changed because of the declining estrogen. And so the earlier that women would start hormone replacement therapy, and that's a whole other discussion too, but that transition happens less and it's not as severe. So
I did want to ask about hormone, especially is it called the bioidentical hormone replacement therapy? Because there wasn't hormone replacement therapy in nature. I mean, there isn't, right? So how do other mammals go through it? I've always wondered. How do tribal populations go through menopause? Are they really suffering as much? Or maybe is it a case of socially, maybe we demand a lot more from ourselves? in our Western world, as opposed to maybe in tribal populations where perhaps at 50, they're really accepting the role of being the grandmother and just taking the back seat. I don't know, but it's fascinating for me because...
Yes, I think about that too, because what is the biologic function of menopause outside of the cessation of childbearing? I think about that all the time. I actually did a lecture on that recently, where if we look at that piece on its own, we know that women who are more hyperinsulinemic and metabolically unhealthy have worsening vasomotor symptoms. They have worsening menopausal symptoms because of the excess visceral adiposity that they carry as one of the main reasons. But then we also look at even women who are metabolically healthy still have a lot of these unwanted effects of menopause. And a lot of times it's the vasomotor symptoms, the hot flashes, sometimes it's anxiety, sometimes it's short-tempered. But when we look at those symptoms are very similar to what happens during lactational phase of our postpartum period, okay? And that's really exciting because the estrogen and progesterone levels that are with us during the lactational period are of that of menopause, okay? Now, why would that be? Well, because it's kind of like nature's way of keeping us focused on one kid, okay? If our estrogen levels were back up to the normal phase, then we would start ovulating again, and then we would have another baby, okay? And so to have low estrogen levels prevents ovulation, and that's the first thing. But the hot flashes come for actual radiant warming of the newborn, okay, which is really neat to think about at night, those late night feeds and stuff, and you're trying to warm your baby and stuff, and you put that baby right on your chest. You get that nice basal body temperature regulation. And so that is also what happens during lactation, right? And then the dryness of the vagina, because, nature doesn't want you to have another kid. And so they don't want you to have more lubrication to accommodate intercourse, right? So, and also what also happens is that hyper awareness, and that has to do with our evolution of keeping our baby safe. Now, how does that relate to menopause? Because the thought is that the maturity and the intergenerational wisdom that the maternal matriarch has to give to assist younger generations during that time, their time of new parenthood, is very useful to have matriarchal societies assist with the child rearing. So that's why we have hot flashes during this time to assist new moms during that lactational period, to help them stay awake or to take over the baby's care at night when moms need to sleep. And remember, for thousands of years, for millennia, we lived in ancestral cultures together with communities assisting each other, helping. And so there's really great data to support that those cultures, ancestral cultures, native cultures that still live in intergenerational communities, have way less postpartum depression and have a lot less symptoms of perimenopause because of these reasons, because it's very useful and because they're not exposed to Western diet that causes all these problems. And so if we look at it in terms of how we as matriarchs can assist with the intergenerational wisdom that we have, those biologic changes that come with menopause are very useful to new families and the baby. Cool, huh?
Can I say something here? I completely agree with this, but I think that there's one more factor that maybe isn't considered in this, is that if you look back at the native cultures, and specifically the ones who are still living together, even if they're eating the wrong Western diet, still their social matrix is very tight, and that travels between people, how you feel and how you think, but you also have to look at your environment. So what's with our environment? I am at home right now in a suburban area. I hear airplanes, cars honking. I'm not even in an apartment. I have a house, right, completely separate. There's barely anybody on the streets. You still hear a lot of noise. So you have noise pollution, you have air pollution, you have light pollution, you have all these electrical equipment around you that you're constantly watching TV or your phone or any kind of an app or device. So you have a lot more stimulation of your brain ongoing, continuously, which isn't normal in terms of human evolution. It's just sort of kind of happened and we live with it. But I wonder how much this initiates hormonal releases that can then tinker with our biological hormonal releases as well. So maybe the fact that I have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning to get to work and I have a 4-hour traffic ahead of me, maybe that's going to initiate some unpleasant hormonal releases that can affect how my estrogen or progesterone or my general well-being in terms of my time of reducing all these hormones and how they work. Maybe it's affecting it in a level that heightens the sensitivity to it. And so we are more sensitized by it than if you lived in a little culture somewhere on a reservation, maybe even within the United States, as sick as you may be with metabolic disease, but you're still within your culture and you're still within your territory that is not surrounded necessarily by all these modern inventions and noises and other things.
I think that's absolutely right. I totally agree with that, because I talk about this in somewhat with my patients who are experiencing infertility, and they are always within their rational brain, that prefrontal cortex, always saying, I can have a baby, I'm doing great. Well, then tell me about your commute. Oh, I commute 2 hours a day each way, and exactly. I sit in the car, and I don't really like my partner, and all of these things that you're able to rationalize that your body's still okay. Maybe they're having regular periods, but they're like, why can't I get pregnant? Well, your reptilian brain is very much aware of the biologic threat of having a baby during the time that is not safe for someone. And so you can rationalize all you want, but your reptilian brain's always monitoring what's going on, is this safe or not? And then you hear about patients who've been on IVF for years, and then they go on vacation or they break up with their old mean boyfriend, and then they get pregnant with like a new partner super easily, or and it's absolutely, there is so much, and that noise, right? What is that noise doing to our biology? Absolutely. So thanks, Dr. Stanton, for bringing that up.
Dr. Stanton, some of those contributors that you mentioned that disrupt metabolic health, do we find fewer cases of migraines, for example, in tribal communities or closely knit communities? That's an interesting.
I don't know. That would be an interesting study. I don't think that anybody's ever looked into that. The people that I work with, I don't think that I have anybody. Maybe I have 1 or 2 people from local American or maybe Canadian First Nation or American Indian reservations. I don't know, but I don't think that any other, see, it's limiting also, well, who has access to Facebook, right? So maybe they don't have access to Facebook on those, in those, I really wouldn't know, but it would be an interesting thing. But one thing is important in this regard is that I have found on my own experience, I haven't discussed this with anybody or even in my book, and maybe it's something of an important topic, is that the busier your life gets and the more stress, be it good stress or bad stress, it doesn't matter what kind, but just the factor that you have stress releases hormones that will initiate a problem with your metabolic health. So we know that if you're, for example, don't get enough sleep, for whatever reason, happiness or sadness, it doesn't matter why. If you don't get enough sleep, you will end up on a slippery slope toward type 2 diabetes. In fact, I believe it was UC Irvine, and I may be wrong in this, but I saw this many, many years ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago, on 60 Minutes, as a matter of fact, where they were doing a research study in a university. They had, I believe, 20 students, volunteers, and they broke them into 2 groups. And for 2 weeks, they were sleeping on campus, eating on campus. They all got the exact same thing. And between the 2 groups, the difference is that one group was not allowed to sleep as long as the other group. So they were awoken by, I think, 10 minutes earlier, but it may have been longer. I don't remember the exact details. But just so that you know that they were awoken a tiny bit earlier. For 2 weeks, every single day, they ate the same, played the same, 24/7, they were together. And the group that was awoken a little bit earlier by the end of the study, they showed a 20% increase toward the chance of getting type 2 diabetes. So their metabolic markers have decreased in 2 weeks from a little bit less sleep. Now, imagine what that does to people in general, anywhere and everywhere and every day. And so this is a collective problem to all who are within the Western society. But if you pick, if you happen to be lucky and your mother picked a culture and you were born into one where this isn't followed, your sensitivity is very different, and you may not be up against the same kind of problems as we are, with both childbearing as well as, of course, the menopausal, the hot flashes and so forth, and of course, migraine. Even if you have migraine brain, if I was born on an island where all I ate was just animal products and I had no extra stimulation and I had plenty of salt as much as I wanted, I would not know I'm a migrainer, right? So it has to express based on the environment.
That's wonderful. So we mentioned insulin. So what are some of the other hormones that perimenopausal women have imbalances in? Okay, so estrogen is declining. Insulin is rising, probably. Cortisol is probably higher. What else?
Yes, there is also a decline in obviously progesterone, because progesterone is the hormone that is associated with ovulation, and it stabilizes the lining of the uterus. It causes a lot of smooth muscle relaxation, but yes, a lot of people will use natural hormone progesterone creams, and I know that you mentioned you were asking about bioidentical hormones, and I think those are really great, medications for people to consider if they're in that perimenopausal phase, because a lot of folks really do kind of self-treat in a way with different creams and stuff to help with a lot of the subtle side effects of perimenopause, the anxiety, the nervousness, the difficulty sleeping and stuff. And a lot of that has to do with a lot of the progesterone, the lack of progesterone. And so what is the role for hormone replacement therapy? Well, if you looked at just like the guidelines of using it, one of the big ones is to use for vasomotor symptoms or hot flashes. But there's a lot of really great off-label uses that are very helpful. For example, vaginal dryness or depression or irritability or just all these subtle things, migraines, a lot of really subtle side effects that a lot of people think that are related to 10 other different reasons, helps with sleep and insomnia. Now, hormone replacement therapy, and as it relates to bioidentical hormones, there's a lot of folks that have, just clinics just focused on this, where they give pellets and troches and all these things. And I think that is one way to go. It's not my specialty, because I really kind of believe in trying to make this work accessible. And a lot of those kind of specialized hormone clinics are very pricey. And so there is a lot of the stuff that we use in just regular traditional medicine is, estrogen progestin based, which are pharmacologically manufactured. But there are two bioidentical pharmacologically manufactured hormones that we use, which is just basically the estradiol patch, or vaginal estrogen, or oral estrogen, which is estradiol. And then there is a micronized progesterone, which comes in a capsule that you can use orally or vaginally. And those are two very bioidentical formulations. And of course, hormones like birth control pills and all these other varieties are the estradiol is very bioidentical, but the progesterone is modified into a progestin, and the progestin is all the different things that you've heard about: desogestrel, levonorgestrel. Those are all the ways that the pharmaceutical companies can patent these hormones and then sell them. But the bioidentical estradiol patches and pills are very inexpensive. and bioidentical, and it's something that can be used and very accessible. And a lot of times we can titrate those based on patients' feelings and how the symptoms are improved. I don't check levels. I don't really believe in that personally. I'm open to learning more, but I just really want to focus on how folks are feeling and treat the symptoms rather than a number, because imagine how incredibly validating it is that if someone still has a lot of the symptoms, but their number is normal, like that to me doesn't make any sense, because you feel sad, you're like, what? And these hormones change all the time, and so it's just, to me, it's not worth it. It's kind of, maybe a little bit of financial incentive for folks to keep checking, but on the other hand, I just more like to treat the symptoms than the numbers.
And of course, it is possible to also treat the symptoms with some supplements. So are you aware of any supplements, vitamins, or even minerals? And that also relates to Angela's work with the minerals that can help perimenopausal symptoms.
Yeah, I know very generally, but not probably as well as your local naturopath. I do believe in vitamin D. I think that checking vitamin D3 is really important to make sure that that's at a normal level. There's acupuncture really helps, because it also helps with like changing meridians in ways that I'm not really understanding, but really helps with vasomotor symptoms and stuff. And, I know there's these powders and roots and things, and I think those are all great. And, I think we have to be careful with a little bit of turmeric, because a little bit too much turmeric can make people have a lot more bleeding. And then when I'm a surgeon, so I think of bleeding like all the time. And so I think that that's something you have to be careful of. But I know, and I'm really interested to see what Dr. Stanton says about salts and magnesium, because I think that's a huge topic and worth mentioning and devoting some time to, about how that relates to perimenopausal symptoms and triggering migraines in the perimenopause. Like, what would you say, Angela? What do you think about that?
Okay, so first of all, I have to say that I'm not a fan of herbs, because herbs are basically medications. They come from the Chinese medicine, and they're actually medicines. So they're not really supplements per se.
Yeah.
But they're like really are from the root or from, right. So they really truly are medicines. So I would not use them as a preventive for anything whatsoever, because they can't prevent anything. What they can do, if you end up sick, and if you know that the kind of illness that you have will respond to a very specific chemical, and that herb happens to have that chemical, then that's fine. But then you don't know what else they're going to do and how they're going to interact, because nobody has studied them. So there's just a very big black hole when it comes to herbals. So I'm not supporting them. I've tried actually for menopause. And it's interesting that we're talking about, because I had a complete hysterectomy when I was 42. So we're talking about 30 years ago. Okay. And that was a rude awakening. It was really interesting, because I had everything taken out. And the doctor came back in after surgery, and I said, hi. And I just started crying. I had no pain, discomfort. I just started crying. I just broke down. And he said, okay, you need estrogen. That was just really an interesting take. And I've been on estrogen ever since, hormone equivalent, bioidentical estrogen tablet, estradiol. And I think I'm going to die with an estrogen in my mouth. So let's just put that out there. Good. Yeah, it's just very important. And my doctor, it was very, very important for me to read all the warnings and everything. I said, okay, just put that away. I'm familiar with it. It's not true. Whatever, I'm going to be dying with an estrogen in my mouth when I'm however old. 125, I will still be taking estrogen. I don't care what. Yes. But in terms of supplements, coming back to the actual supplements, so minerals and vitamins, which are not necessarily dangerous. They can be, but they don't have to be. Many of these supplements that we're talking about, like magnesium, sodium, potassium, calcium, these are all electrolytes. And of course, we got the D3, and we got a host of other kind of vitamins that are important for our body to function properly. But in terms of migraine, what I am looking at are those that facilitate the electrical activity of the neurons in the brain. Because basically migraine is a genetic difference in the brain of a migraine sufferer versus a person who isn't a migraine sufferer. So if you are not a migraine, if you don't have a migraine brain, no matter how bad your menopause or perimenopause is, you can't get a migraine. It just doesn't happen. You can get a headache, not a migraine. And so there are huge differences. And in terms of having perimenopause or menopausal symptoms for a migraine versus a non-migraine, those are the same, because that's not different, at least not that I so far have discovered it. But a migraine brain is very different. And so because of the chemical differences and the in terms of migraine, just to be very simple about it, think about the ionic channels that operate the brain, the electricity. Think about them like doors, but these doors have to be opened. And these doors are what is referred to as voltage gated doors. So they use energy, they use ATP, but how does that energy go to that door to open it? And so all of these, like magnesium, is one of these minerals which literally attaches to the door, takes an ATP with it to open the door. And so the function of the magnesium is to enrich the particular voltage gate with magnesium to provide the ATP to open the door. And so these are all chemical reactions. And so when I'm looking at it this way, I have to understand how these chemicals work. And so when this door is opened, then sodium and potassium can come and go from the cell and initiate the function of the electrical activity, the action potential and the resting potential and the recovery. And so magnesium is essential. But if I'm looking at some other minerals, say potassium, potassium is always inside the cell, and it's in the right amount, it's coming in from our food. And potassium is a very large molecule. So if I'm looking at the molecules between potassium, sodium, and magnesium, sodium is very tiny. Magnesium is still small, but is larger than sodium, but still small. Potassium is huge. So when you're looking at these molecules, then you know that the channels, the doors, have to be different size, because for each, there will have to be unique doors. So a sodium cannot go through a potassium door because the electricity and the shape of the door is different. Potassium cannot go through a sodium door because the potassium is much bigger. And this is very important because when you eat food and you drink water and then you say urinate, we excrete a lot of sodium by our urines, but not potassium, because potassium is too big. So if our kidneys have to eliminate potassium, the way the kidneys work is, think of it like a net of holes. That's the particular tube through which the kidneys will either eliminate minerals or retain by changing the size of these holes on the wall. So this is the constriction of the kidney, the recycling versus the dilation of the kidneys, these particular tubes, to allow bigger molecules to leave. But if you open the holes to be bigger so potassium can leave, then a lot of sodium will leave, because sodium is so small that it's going to leave, and magnesium will leave, and calcium will leave, because all of them are smaller than potassium. And so we recycle potassium. So we don't have to eat that much potassium, and they're not in our blood. Potassium is mostly inside the cells. Sodium is the other way around. It's mostly in the blood. It's not inside the cell. And so what you supplement will depend upon the location of these elements, because if you take potassium with water, it's going to go to your blood, which is the wrong place to be. And if you take salt with food, it's going to go to the wrong place, because it's going to go into the intestines and it's going to go through, and it goes end up inside the cells. So that's the wrong place. So you need to understand that taking potassium with your food, you want to have a high potassium food, but you want to take your salt with water. And so magnesium falls with either, because we have very little in both inside the cell and also outside of the cell. So if I'm looking at it in milliequivalent, potassium is going to be magnesium will be much less than all the others. And so we still supplement it because we need to have this frequency of opening of the door in a migraine brain much more than in a regular brain. And so people who have listened to our interview, a previous discussion on this, will know it's because the migraine brain has a lot more connections between the sensory neurons. So there are a lot more doors have to open and close and open and close much more often. So we need more magnesium. So I recommend magnesium supplementation, and I recommend salt supplementation. But I'm very anti-potassium, for example, because of the problem that it ends up in the wrong place and it will interfere with everything and may even cause heart arrhythmia. So I'm very selective. And one of the things that I do with any migraine who comes to me is I look through all the medications that they take, all the vitamins they take. If they're on herbs, I tell them to stop, or they can sign a waiver that they understand the risks. I look at interactions if I have the chance and help them clear the mess of all the medications, and then send a note to the doctors that, hey, interaction between these, take it off. You know, they're taking herbals, the licorice, okay, you can't take salt, so you have a choice. You either take salt or you continue with your licorice because they interact. It can even cause death. Most people don't know that. So herbals are really, really dangerous. So when it comes to supplement, it's really on a one-to-one individual base. What are you taking and what you need to stop right away and what you can continue.
Have you noticed a trend of certain interactions that will kind of improve or resolve people's migraines or their tendency, you know, common drug interactions that you've seen that are, you've just taken this off and then all of a sudden they get better?
Yeah, most of the calcium channel blockers and sodium channel blockers. And so you're talking about basically 90% of the migraine medications. When they're taken off of these, then finally, see, what happens is the calcium channel blockers, they definitely work in reducing seizures and reducing migraines. Migraines and seizures are basically the same thing, just manifest differently, but they're basically the same thing. So whatever will work for seizure will work for migraine, but it's just going to do it in a different way. But what they're doing is they basically, rather than opening the door and adding more salt and magnesium to help the door open more often, they literally block the door from opening. So they basically block the brain from working. And so when you remove, so say somebody is on, say, Topamax or topiramate in generic, which is a calcium and sodium voltage-gated channel blocker. If you remove the people from them, they're going to immediately start getting better because suddenly the sodium and calcium channels open so the brain can return to work, because otherwise it's degenerative. It's brain degenerative, because if you shut down certain neurons from working, they're not needed. They're going to be trimmed. Connections are trimmed. So you're starting a dementia basically on those medications. So, but what they have, if they just quit, then nothing is improving and they're going to be in trouble. But if they quit and they take the salt and they take the magnesium and, you know, making possible for the brain to recover right away and start working, then they're going to immediately feel better, because now the brain is working and is getting the salt. They still may have metabolic disease and they still have a lot of work to do, but they have an immediate instant success at least part of the month. And so this is really interesting that some people have these really quick responses, but some people don't. So it depends also how long they've taken it. Because if you've taken a medication that has been blocking your voltage-gated calcium channels for 10 years, then most of those voltage-gated calcium channels are probably shot, damaged, and they can't work anymore. And without the calcium being able to enter the cell through these high voltage gated doors, the neurotransmitters cannot be released. And so those neurons are silenced and they can't work. And so sometimes it's gone too far and we can't repair the damage. And sometimes it's an instant repair. So, you know, it's a roulette of whoever is going to respond to treatment fast or well. We don't know.
Andrea, in one of your videos, I think it was about endometriosis. You're talking about endometriosis, and you mentioned specifically vitamin A. Am I correct? It was one of your videos.
Yes. So it's very interesting what we're noticing about endometriosis and theories of pathology. There's been several theories about how endometriosis comes to be. Endometriosis is when we find ectopic endometrial cells, or cells from the lining of the uterus, that are implanted in different places in the abdomen. But you know, unusually we've even seen it on pathology reports in the eye and in the lung and in the brain. And so that's what has led to so many different theories about how endometriosis comes to be. Some of them are lymphatic spread. Some of them are coelomic metaplasia, which basically means like our germ cell layers of our cells just spontaneously change into these endometrial cells. And some of them, one of the other prevailing theories is called Sampson's theories of retrograde menstruation, where the lining of the uterus, normally when we have a menstrual cycle, empties through the vagina, but it also empties through the fallopian tubes. And we always kind of forget that. And a lot of women who have had tubal ligations always talk about that, oh, my periods were heavier after the tubal ligation. Well, that's just because their tubes were tied, not because there was any kind of hormone change that a lot of people talk about. But that being said, the blood goes through the fallopian tubes and it empties into the space between the rectum and the vagina, or in the uterus. And so a lot of people describe like this painful kind of fullness in their pelvis, and then they actually have like pain when they go have a bowel movement during their menstrual cycle because of that inflammation. That's common. But then what also happens is that when we our blood goes there and then it gets processed, and our immune cells go in and processes the blood, and that's with everyone who has a monthly menstrual cycle with open tubes. Well, then 10% of people have endometriosis. And the reason why we're finding out is that it seems that there is a gut dysbiosis. So as soon as the gut microbiome is interrupted or impacted or impaired or obliterated, then that allows a leakage of inflammatory molecules. For example, a lot of gram-negative bacteria that reside in our gut normally, and then if the gut is under any kind of insult from processed food, from smoking, from trauma, that allows those lipopolysaccharides from gram-negative bacteria, but also other proteins that just shouldn't be in our peritoneal cavity, to leak through, and it goes into the space through gravity, the space between our rectum and our uterus, and it causes a lot of inflammation. And then our immune system is activated in order to clear a lot of those inflammatory factors. But chronic low-grade inflammation is not good. It's almost as if like you had a paper cut and you kept getting cut in that same spot over and over and over. Your body will never repair itself. And we have all these macrophages and mast cells, they're ready, and endothelial or vascular factors to help repair those areas. Then your menstrual cycle happens, and those cells of the lining of the uterus recannulate into these active, vasoactive inflammatory cells that create new blood supply between the lining of the uterine cells and your pelvic cavity, or the cells in our intestines. And then those cells get new blood supply and become active and receive the hormone signaling of menses every month, just like any other lining of the uterine cells in the lining of the uterus, but they're bleeding on your intestines and in the space between the rectum and the vagina. And it's the cycle. Well, how does that relate to vitamin A? Well, vitamin A is a prebiotic, okay? And the form that's very helpful is called butyrate. And butyrate is actually food for our intestines, for our gut microbiome. And that creates a ton of immune factors that help protect and create a protective barrier in our gut microbiome. When, many years ago, when we used to eat nose to tail, when we would eat and sacrifice an animal, we would honor the animal by eating the whole animal, by eating every part of it, including the liver. The liver is the biggest storage facility in our body of vitamin A. And so while liver is not fun to eat, and we don't eat like ancestral cultures anymore, we are hugely deficient in vitamin A. And the vitamin A that comes from carrots is not the active form of vitamin A that we need. And so it's very much has to do with the organ meats of eating liver, to help cure and nourish our gut microbiome. Now, that's not what people eat anymore. And so a lot of times we have to supplement. And a huge game changer in my practice is to supplement with cod liver oil, because cod liver oil has omega-3 fatty acid, vitamin A, and vitamin D. And so I used to see a lot of improvements in patients with omega-3 fatty acids, very helpful. However, once I elevated that and started to realize and read in the literature about the gut dysbiosis that happens in endometriosis and how we're so deficient in vitamin A, I started including that instead of regular, omega-3 fatty acid. I've noticed a huge improvement in my patients' symptoms. And so I'm actually getting ready to start a randomized controlled clinical trial looking at the use of vitamin A in cod liver oil. It has made a huge improvement in my patients' practice. And it's something that I feel really passionate about. And so, yes, vitamin A all the way.
So it's interesting because when I was interviewing Dr. Rachel Brown from the UK, and she's a metabolic health practitioner, but also a psychiatrist, a senior psychiatrist from Edinburgh. So she also talked about the link between the microbiome and brain health. So now you're referring to it too. Dr. Stanton, is there a link between, I guess it's kind of a brain issue. So is there a link between migraines and gut dysbiosis?
I got this question just the other day, and I don't think that there is. It is not in a direct sense like what right now Dr. Salcedo explained. It's a lot more subtle, because whereas endometriosis is a condition that develops as a result of certain irritants in the life of the person, migraine is something you're born with. I mean, it's a genetic condition. So it's not something that you would expect to be directly influenced. And I'm saying directly because indirectly, what you eat and how you eat obviously affect your gut flora and also affect your metabolic health and thereby affect your migraine expression. But whether you have a migraine brain or not, that's not going to be affected, because that's something that you're born with. That's not something you can just suddenly come up with. And whether you're going to have a migraine later on as you progress in your life clearly has a connection to your food, what you eat. Now, whether that is just purely as it appears to be a metabolic condition in terms of glucose, which is what currently, as I understand migraine, as I just published an article in this, developing the argument that basically, because we know that when glucose enters the cells, it removes sodium and water from that cell. This is the process how glucose can enter the cell. It needs a transport system. And so it is going to remove these two elements from the cell, the very things that are, particularly sodium, that are essential for the electrolyte, for the action potential in the brain. So we're talking about in the brain. And so in this particular activity, which we can stop, by the way, by simply not eating carbohydrates and increasing salt. So the connection there is 100% shown to be correct. There is no effect here of gut flora. So there is no direct connection to becoming a person with active migraine as a result of an insufficient or inappropriate gut flora. And it can't affect whether you end up a migrainer or you don't end up a migrainer, because that's a birth genetic content. Whether your migraines will express, that's a different story. And so we all have different genetic variants, but we know that each genetic variant on its own is meaningless, because everything has backup and different levels of genetics. So for example, if you go for a simple variant, simply MTHFR, that everybody seems to know, which is the B9 and B12, just because you have the variant, it doesn't mean you have the condition, because you have to have 12, maybe 100 other variants expressed above it, if you're looking at it in the chain of events, before this one is going to turn up. And also, if you don't have the variant, you can still have problem with the B9 or B12. So the genetics doesn't necessarily have a direct relation to what will happen to you in your life. It's going to be always an environmental exposure that is going to make it appear or not appear. And so in that context, yes, there would be a gut flora connection, because gut flora is part of you. It's a very large part of your body. And so it is going to affect what is going to be the nutrient outcome for you.
And this is why your recommended diet focuses on animal based protein.
Right. Very high
And the
animal-based
good
protein.
amount of fat, right?
Right. Well, not so much fat. So the migraine diet is, although it's metabolically similar to what other people would refer to as carnivore or low carb or keto, it's actually lower in fat and higher in protein.
Right.
Because what we want to do, we don't want to make them thinner. They aren't necessarily overweight. They may not even have type 2 diabetes. So the goal for what I'm trying to make sure is to stabilize their blood glucose levels, whatever that means. And so if they not going to have enough protein in their diet and they can't synthesize protein, then much of that protein is going to convert to glucose. That's going to be a problem of causing an imbalance of their glucose. And I wanted to stabilize it, right? So they have to eat them more protein. But then if they eat too much protein, then I'm going on the other end, that they have reached the limit of how much they can synthesize, because that's a very energy demanding process for our body, and everything has to be just right. And then if they eat too much, they're going to end up with what's called a protein sweat, which I ended up with 2 nights ago. And I tell you, that was not pleasant. I ate just a lot of meat. That was just really good. And so you have to put on the brakes. But if you don't have the proper protein base and you eat a lot of fat, fat is just energy. So basically, you aren't able to rebuild your cells or nourish your cells. You're not doing any protein synthesis. There are no anabolic functions when you're eating a lot of fat. It's supposed to become a catabolic function. That's the whole point of not eating other foods, but eating fat. Fat is not a nutrient on its own. It can fill the tummy and it will provide you some energy, but it's not going to be able to create new red blood cells or new skin cells, and it won't be able to do a lot of things that your whole body requires. And so when you're looking at it this way, things are a little bit changed. So I focus on retaining a stable glucose level. And so all my meal plans that I have for my migraineurs are higher in protein than your normal, usual. So even my low carb high fat is much higher in protein and lower in fat, and my keto is way lower in fat. Or if somebody no longer has migraines, fine, they can do anything they want as long as they're not on medication either. They can do whatever. Like, I don't have migraines anymore. I can do whatever. It doesn't matter. If I don't eat for 5 days, I'm not going to have any variation in my blood sugar. None, zero. I'm totally fine. But if you're just starting out and you're still getting migraines, you can't do that. You have to first treat everything to stabilize. It may take as little as 2 weeks, maybe 3 years. We now have cases for both in the group. We don't know which one's going to be you, but you have to have lower fat, higher protein, and moderate carb. You don't necessarily even want to be in ketosis. It's not a benefit for migraine.
So that's very interesting. So it's like, if you've been treated in the right way with the right normal glycemia for a long period of time or a short period of time, it's unlikely that you'll have migraines to recur if the longer you've been away from cure. Is that right? Why is that?
Right. Okay, I think, and this is just guessing, it's a hypothesis and I don't know, but it's definitely true. It happened to me. I no longer get migraines, and I tested it now for a past couple of years of eating completely un-migraine approved foods. Like, I would be eating watermelon, I would be eating cherries, I would be eating sugar, and I won't get a migraine to a limited time period. So I guess what's happening is that I have built up reserves enough where my body is able to pull from resources where, like, for example, salt, which is the most important in the case of migraine. There's a huge salt reserve in our bones. And so, but if you are following the Western diet, which is very low in salt, and they keep on telling you to lower it even further, and if you're just taking, mostly junk food and all, which is without any kind of nutrients, then you are not going to have as big of a salt reserve as perhaps a person like me after 10, by now it's over 12 years of constant high levels of salt in my water all the time. So I have built up a reserve, and it never harmed me. My blood pressure is just as low as it's always been. Everything actually even lower sometimes, depending on what I drink and how much I drink. But the salt level is in there and my body is feeling safe. And I think this goes back into women in general, in that, and our health, is how comfortable our bodies are on the long run will affect how well we can adapt to something new, including the pregnancy, right? Because what you were explaining, that your body will decide whether you are going to be able to get pregnant or not, no matter how hard you try. If your body isn't at its comfort zone, it won't let you. And I think it's the same with migraine. If your brain is not at a comfort zone with knowing that it has enough of the salt, it has enough of the glucose that it needs for the glial cell, it has enough ketones, for example, if your brain is in ketosis, whatever it needs, if it doesn't have a long enough exposure to safety and security, your thyroid is going to send the message that it's a no-go. And I think the thyroid has a lot to do with this, because it is going to control how much of your thyroid hormone is going to be put toward energy versus put for restoration and safe and weight. Like our thyroid T3, for example, will move into RT3 from T4. Instead of switch to T3, it's going to be RT3 to back burner to lower our metabolic speed. And when you lower your metabolic speed, everything is lower and your tolerance is going to change. And so I think I see the body as a system. It's not like just one thing like migraine or endometriosis or having any kind of female order. It's a system. And if you move one brick out of the system, the whole building may not collapse, but it's not going to be the same building. Something is going to have to make up for the lack of that one little brick, right? So it doesn't collapse, but you don't know which one that is. And so when I'm looking at migraine in this context, yeah, it may affect it, but I built up a tolerance. You can pull that brick, the building won't collapse, but it's going to be much weaker than it was before. And at any time, it can collapse should you pull another brick, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When I was in medical school, I used to get a lot of migraines, and I was like eating high sugar all the time and a lot of grains and just really imbalanced, of course, in training. And then I haven't had a migraine in probably 10, 15 years. And but of course, like, I've got kids and I'm a normal person, and every, once in a while I have like a high carbohydrate meal, and, I don't get a migraine, and, of course I'll get Randall cycle while I'm super sleepy, but yeah, I don't feel quite as triggered. I think that's fascinating that, you can kind of fall back into these old habits, but not get as affected as one used to be over that chronic affliction.
One more thing to add to this. With you too, Dr. Salcedo and I get together for lunch time to time. And so, for example, you have a bottle of the electrolyte, the salt, with you. And so it is important to have it available. So if I feel that I have sort of outlived my welcome for eating all the sugar or eating all the watermelon or whatever else, then I have the backup of, okay, I need to restore my salt. And then I will take a salt capsule right away, which I always do, by the way, and I double up all the time. So I never go without salt. Somebody asked me just yesterday, do you always carry? I said, yes, I don't go without salt, even to the bathroom. Even at home, I have it in every pocket. You just have to have it, and you have to get used to continuously replenish it. And then when you do that, you build up a Chinese wall that is very strong, and no enemy can bring you down.
Angela, do you think that's why, this is really probably very ignorant, but do you think that's why, like, the settlers of, like, the folks from the, from the 1600s, 1500s, when they were looking for spices in the old world to the new world, salt was like a big thing, while they were, because of course we use it to cure and preserve meat and things, but do you think that's another reason why, I think for many millennia, we were so dependent on salt, and salt was gold, right? Do you think that's why, because of how important it is to our metabolism, that's one of the big reasons why we were searching for it?
That's one of them. If you look at animals, mammals, they all search for salt, right? They have to find their annual salt, be it vegetarians like elephants or all mammals, even lions will seek out salt water. And in fact, I feed my cat salt water because lions and the cat family in general are the only animals can actually drink salt water and metabolize it. So salt is essential for all animals, particularly for mammals. And of course, we are a prime example of doing that. But don't forget that salt is also not just a preservative, which of course was very important for humans to preserve because they had no refrigeration and be salted, right? They dried and salted meat and fish and other things, but it is also an antiseptic. And so you can put it literally on your wound. It will hurt really badly. I don't know if you've ever tried it, but if you don't have anything better than that, you want to put salt wherever you cut yourself because it is guaranteed to suck out all the moisture from there, kill all the bacteria, and whatever is there is going to be dead. And you can also, for example, if you're somewhere and you don't have drinking water and you're at a creek, but you can't drink the water from the creek because it may have some amoeba, which could be very dangerous to you. But I bet you can put salt in it. It's going to kill the amoeba, and then you can drink the water.
Wow.
I don't know. I haven't tried and I haven't seen it anywhere, but I'm just thinking that that's probably true because it's going to desalinate the water. It's going to kill freshwater creatures in there, and then you're safe to drink it. So salt probably had a lot bigger role. And the spices too, actually. I just saw a video the other day on spices and the history of why humans like spices. But turns out that in the history of evolution, if you didn't eat spices, you didn't survive because spice too, they have the same role. They will eliminate all pathogens from the food. So they could be using the spices to basically remove bacteria and spoilage and prevent any kind of things to happening. And I'm applying this now with my bird seeds, covering it with spices. It eliminates a lot of animals that are unwanted and probably keeps the environment more sterile as well.
Wow, that was a lot.
All this salt talk is so interesting for me as well because I've been trying this actually because we know that dehydration, for example, will result in higher blood sugars. All diabetics know that. Are you dehydrated? If you can't explain why your blood sugars are high, for example, in the morning, I don't usually eat it first thing in the morning. So ideally, I should wake up with the same blood sugar every single morning. Some mornings I wake up high for no reason other than obviously dehydration. So I've tried having a glass of water and then checking again half an hour later, and then having a glass of salted water and then checking. The salt water is instant. The effect, it just drops. I literally can see my blood sugar dropping from 180 crashing right down to normal levels, not hypoglycemic,
not low normal,
normal levels.
Right. But you know why?
So quickly. And of course, I know that there is, because the other day I saw Ben Bickman was talking about insulin sensitivity and
No. That's not it. I mean, I don't know what he was talking about, but that's not the connection. Everybody thinks of insulin as a prime glucose carrier,
right.
But actually sodium is.
Wow.
About 80 to 90% of the glucose that you eat under normal circumstances are going to be taken by sodium through voltage-gated sodium channels. There's the SGLT or SLGT, I always call it's the sodium light glucose transporters. We have sodium transport system for glucose. Our brain, for example, we have insulin, but in our brain, we don't use insulin for glucose at all. It's going to be right. the GLUT3 for the insulin U, which is the sodium transporter, and GLUT1 to go through the blood-brain barrier, which is a sodium transporter. So you basically all of our body, even though we have insulin nearly on every cell, we don't use insulin necessarily to carry glucose into the cell. We use sodium. And so this is one of the reasons why, and I think now you're going to really relate to it, for a migrainer who is extremely carbohydrate sensitive, we follow every carbohydrate meal with a salt capsule or salt without water, because the point is that the glucose takes also water out of the body. So when you take salt, the salt is going to bring the water back into the cell. And so it's going to change the entire environment. Just taking salt, that's fantastic. And if you're very thirsty, don't drink water, just take salt, because that means that, unless of course you haven't had water and you're totally dehydrated, but if you eat some fruit or some vegetable that has carbohydrates in it, if you end up thirsty, don't drink water, just take salt.
Wow, that's
simple.
amazing.
Yeah.
That's fascinating, totally. Let's get back to women. Okay, so menopausal women, some menopausal women experience heavy bleeding. You kind of alluded to it earlier on, and you're what's happening there?
Your question is, some menopausal, perimenopausal women have heavy bleeding. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Yes.
Or a menstrual cycle that doesn't seem to stop.
Yes.
For weeks.
So remember, there's a couple of reasons. So the first is it a heavy bleed because they're having an anovulatory cycle that has to do with ovulation? And then there's another thing about, is it the structure of the uterus and the lining of the uterus that has inflammation at the blood vessels that are making it difficult for the microvasculature to constrict? Okay. And so there's two things. So the first is that if it's an anovulatory cycle, because perimenopausal women might not be ovulating every month anymore, then the progesterone withdrawal from ovulation never occurs. And so the lining of the uterus just tends to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow with estrogen unopposed. And so you need that estrogen in the first half of the month, and the second half of the month is the progesterone that comes to stabilize the lining of the uterus. But if you never have the ovulation that brings about the progesterone, then the lining of the uterus will just grow and grow. And then randomly, 1 or 2 weeks after your menstrual cycle is supposed to come, you'll just have these breakthrough bleeding episodes that last a long time. And that's just because there's more lining to shed off. And it just is prolonged and unexpected, and usually doesn't come with that much cramping or pain. So that's one piece of anovulatory cycles that can lead to heavy menses, but it's not really a menstrual cycle. It's just the shedding because the lining of the uterus has outgrown its blood supply because it's so thick. Now, and then the term of heavy menstrual, of bleeding from heavy or from regular ovulatory cycles, the older we get, the more endothelial inflammation that we have, and that's cumulative, right? And so, the lining of the uterus is just one big smooth muscle, layers and layers of smooth muscles. And that inflammation at the level of the intima of those blood vessels make it difficult for those blood vessels to constrict when it's finally time to stop bleeding. So normal menstrual cycles should last no more than 5 days. But a lot of people are longer than that because of the impairment of the spiral arteries, which are the blood vessels at the lining of the uterus, and they're not constricting. So the people are just flooding and bleeding these prolonged cycles. A lot of patients get very frustrated because they get pelvic ultrasounds done, and the pelvic ultrasound doesn't show fibroids, or the uterus is normal, but they're like, why am I bleeding? It's because the pelvic ultrasound doesn't look at the microvasculature. And so, then we just have to think about, okay, it's probably abnormal uterine bleeding AUBE from the endometrium, the lining of the uterus. And so Angela and I have talked about this a lot, where a lot of times patients start salt tablets, and then their bleeding is a lot lighter, and it has to do a lot with those sodium channels, and also with magnesium too, with the channels to help constrict, to allow muscles to actually contract and do their thing. And so that happens at the level of the lining of the uterus, the smooth muscles too. And so Angela talks about all the time where she has these migraineurs that say, oh, my periods are much lighter, or they're better. And yeah, it has to do with the sodium and magnesium response at the level of the contractility of the spiral arteries at the lining of the uterus. So that's, it doesn't just have to do with perimenopause, that could be, just from, chronic inflammation at any phase of life. But those are the two big players.
We talked about all of the relevant hormones except testosterone. Does it play a role in menopause, or even when it comes to migraine? Does testosterone level make any difference?
Go ahead, Angela, with the testosterone and migraine. That's interesting.
You know, very few women that I read a lot of blood tests in my group. And of course, women very seldom take testosterone. I have maybe 3 or 4 who are older and they will take testosterone. And I see their blood tests way up the chart. And I would suggest that, yes, I see a little bit of an increase in their potential to get migraine. But I don't know if it is directly the result of the testosterone or as a result of what other changes that makes in the body. That I don't know enough about it to actually know. But what I do know is testosterone is a hormone that is supposed to be in a very small amount in a female, and maybe it is the kind of excitatory hormone, such as the androgenic hormones like adrenaline and similar. So I'm not sure, but if that is the case, then that would initiate more sensitivity toward migraine, because adrenaline is part of the migraine cycle, which I refer to as a tri-migraine complex. So that's part of the fight or flight that is actually initiated by the brain when the brain is running low on sodium because it's not able to work. So it is going to initiate a fight or flight to increase the blood flow to the brain. And of course, that comes with a lot of extra glucose as a result of glycogen. So we have a lot of combination of factors here. So I don't know how testosterone fits into this, but I'm just thinking that it may be a little bit more stimulatory toward the stress hormonal setup. I'm just thinking that. But Andrea, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I don't know a whole lot about testosterone as a whole. You would think that we would more, and as gynecologists, and we do know that it does help increase libido. And I'm actually going to be taking a course sometime soon about looking at testosterone specifically, because we do know that one of the big cautions for a long time was to not take testosterone in perimenopause or in postmenopause for large doses or for too long, because aromatase does bring it back to estrogen, and then it turns into an unopposed estrogen state and increases the risk for uterine cancer. A lot of the newer data shows that that's not quite the case anymore. And so I find that fascinating. But when I was in training for many years, we were told really not to give testosterone for more than 6 months for libido because of that conversion. But yeah, I mean, there's so much. I think it's a hormone that a lot of folks in gynecology were a little reticent about giving and feeling a little more comfortable. But there's a lot of people out there in the functional medicine space that are very liberal with their use of it. But I'm going to say that I don't know enough about it to make really good recommendations of where it fits. But I do think that in terms of the fight or flight mechanism and stuff, and how that relates to migraines and trauma is very interesting. And then we know that very much relates to women's health as well, and the feeling of safety, but also with endometriosis too. So I think that has new avenues for us to study, Nayeri. So thank you.
Okay, is there anything that we left out? It's been wonderful, so a wonderful discussion. Any other things?
Great.
So we were obviously discussing women's health from pregnancy to menopause. Do migraines usually get worse during pregnancy? How does?
Interesting. So I would say that in 99% of the cases, it gets better, because while migraines are not driven by hormones, the change of hormones will modulate your electrolyte balance, because estrogen has the way of recycling, retaining sodium and water. And so it's going to make it it will require it will acquire a larger blood volume as a result of recycling the sodium and water. Whereas progesterone is exactly the opposite. It's just going to waste all the sodium and water. And so when these two move from one cycle to one stage to another, then we see women having some difficult time. And during pregnancy, this cycle stops. And so you would expect to not have any migraines, right? And so for 99% of the women, there are no migraines during pregnancy. And also, as long as they nurse and they keep these hormonal variations still completely blocked off, they don't seem to get any migraines. Of course, if they eat really badly and not eating enough salt, it can still flare, but it's not going to be the same as what it is when they are not pregnant. But interestingly, there are in my group a couple of women, maybe 3 women who are pregnant. And that's another thing. Women on low carb, high fat and carnivore get pregnant really easily. So we have a lot of pregnancies in the group. And interestingly, we now have, I think, 2 women for whom during pregnancy, the migraine intensified. And that I find really interesting because you wouldn't expect that. So unless they have some hormonal abnormalities that I don't know about, and maybe Andrea can speak to some abnormal hormonal variations during the pregnancy, some of these women, even in their 6 months pregnant, we're still having these hormonal variations somehow and are getting a lot more migraines, because otherwise there's no explanation for it. But women do get a lot more migraines in perimenopause and postmenopause. Yes, that is a really bad time, but not during pregnancy. Like I didn't have any migraines during pregnancy. So fascinating.
Yeah,
so
I don't know, because we would think that there would be, you know, I mean, and then I'm just kind of speaking off the cuff here, but I have a lot of patients that describe more headaches in pregnancy, but they're not migraines, you know, and it has to do with a lot of like that smooth muscle relaxation from progesterone. We see that more like 18 to 20-ish weeks or so when the progesterone really starts to ramp up from the placenta. But another interesting caveat is that there is significant hypervolemia that happens in pregnancy to prepare for the upcoming hemorrhage when people have their baby. And I always wondered, and I haven't looked into this, but what does that do to the depletion of electrolytes? And is that causing, you know, a decrease in those electrolytes? I mean, we see it all the time with muscle cramps. And so we start them on magnesium and the muscle cramps resolve. And so, you know, I wonder if, you know, what is that related in terms of salt as well as sodium channels? And if, you know, if that improves anything, or why wouldn't that? Because the hypervolemia that happens outruns the red blood cell increase that happens as well. And so we call it physiologic anemia, because there's an increase in serum, but there's not the same amount of increase in red blood cells that happens to keep up with that. So there's like this physiologic anemia that occurs. But I wonder how that relates to sodium. I think that's more fun stuff to look into.
But you know, but these are people who are already on the protocol, so they're already eating salt, and even then they experience migraine ongoing. And so I don't know how much of a connection there is there, and I don't yet understand this part. We don't have enough experience because it's only really just a couple of women. Most of them don't have any problems. So I'm thinking that maybe there's also some other deficits there. And it might just be, in fact, that these are not migraines, just headaches. But once you're a migrainer, basically all your headaches present as if there were a migraine. It's very difficult to separate, particularly if you have other things happening, such as you're being pregnant. Because I can have a headache, and it takes quite a work to figure out whether my headache is just a headache or is it actually a migraine headache, because it's a huge difference. And so, for example, last week, I had a headache nearly every single day, but I knew what the headache was from. I made a change because I have some back issues and I'm going through physical therapy. And in that process, I said, okay, let me try something different. And so when I'm trying something different, inadvertently, it gave me a headache for like 5 days, but that was not a migraine. And so I need to be able to separate, but you really have to have a lot of diagnostic understanding to distinguish a migraine headache from just a regular everyday garden variety headache. And most people don't have that knowledge, and it's very difficult to tell. And so it can very well, in fact, just be a headache during pregnancy and not a migraine. But you don't always want to fight the battle. It's okay, whatever it is, just get rid of it, right? So that's
right. Yes.
Yeah. I was also wondering, with these few women who have either had headaches or migraines during pregnancy, I wonder if there's a link with insulin resistance, pregnancy-related insulin resistance, or even gestational diabetes.
Could very well be. And I don't know enough, because typically they're either haven't gotten that way yet, or they never, not all women get gestational diabetes tests, so we don't really know. And then some of them are past it already and have been on all kinds of other diets. So they no longer perhaps have it, but they still have the problem. So, but then again, we don't have any controls and we don't have enough to understand it fully. I mean, I have over 17,300 people now in the migraine group overall, but only 2 having migraines during pregnancy. Then I can't say what that is. So
it's been absolutely wonderful. We're going to wrap this up with you telling our audience where they can find you. Angela, let's start off with you.
Okay, start with me. So they can come to my group, and so they can find me on Facebook. Looking for me as Angela A. Stanton, PhD. They're going to find me, and then they can find the group is called Migraine Sufferers, but it has a much longer name when you look for it. So it's kind of harder to find. They can find me on Twitter as @migrainebook. Sorry, not Twitter, X, as @migrainebook. They can find me on LinkedIn as Dr. Angela Stanton or Angela Stanton Age. PhD, one of the two. It's kind of hard. I'm never preparing for this end of the talk.
All the links will be below anyway. So
okay, good. Yeah. So they can, and of course, if they get my book, I have all the contact information in the book as well.
That's right. And I'm, you can find me on my YouTube channel, A Conscious Gynecologist, and I'm open to emails also at consciousgynecology@gmail.com. I also have a few social media accounts that it's just really hard to keep track of, honestly. But, you know, I'm on X and as well as Instagram. But definitely available for any kind of questions. Obviously, it can't be medical advice, but I can help navigate the understanding of where people are. So thank you so much, Nayuri, for the time. And thanks, Angela. It's nice to see you. We have to connect. We need to do lunch soon.
We do,
Yeah,
but Andrea,
yeah,
did you not want to mention the new clinic you're starting, or is
oh, thank you. Oh my gosh, I know, right? That just goes to show. Yeah, so in August, August 1st, I'll be starting telehealth consultations for folks that are in California. Woohoo! And so you don't have to be a resident of California or a citizen of the US or anything. As long as you're in California, I'll be able to do a telehealth consultation with you starting August 1st. And I'll be at the Low Carb Conference also as just a attendee in San Diego, just to enjoy. But yeah, you know, I think there's a lot of really great stuff upcoming for us here in the low carb space, and I'm going to be adding a lecture to Nutrition Network also for their metabolic stuff too. So pretty soon there's more things, but thanks for the plug, Nayuri, for my consultative service that's coming up. So I feel like we're doing such good work, Angela, and you know, I think offering that space, you know, to have people connect with us is really important. Thank you, Nayuri, for facilitating that. We really appreciate your platform and your ability to help us with our mission.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Nayuri. It's the second interview. It's really, really pleasant to talk to you. I'm really looking forward to, and Andrea, we need to meet for lunch again. We used to have these wonderful lunches and chit chat all through about business and all kinds of issues, and we missed that. We've been too busy.
Yes, we'll get together. So Nayuri, when you're in California, let us know.
I sure will. I will. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you.